Good afternoon and welcome to the 2020 launch of the Index of Economic Freedom in Spain. Due to the ongoing situation with the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, we've been unable to hold our traditional physical event as we've done so many times before in the past several years. However, we know that so many people, both in the public and private sphere, are waiting for this moment when this seminal publication is released and so much information regarding the status of economic freedom is available to all of us. And since everyone was ready to have an event like this, we've decided to run it digitally so that we wouldn't miss a thing from the 2020 publication. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. I'm Diego Sánchez de la Cruz, an associate researcher at Instituto de Estudios Económicos, a 40-year-old think tank based in Madrid. Also, let me thank Instituto Juan de Mariana, which is our broadcast partner for today, for putting up all the technology necessary for this broadcast. And most of all, let me thank the free world leading experts that are joining us here today to discuss economic freedom during the next minutes. First of all, we have Ambassador Terry Miller, who has had a long career at the diplomatic service, having been the US ambassador and served at the embassies in different countries, including France and Italy. We also are joined by Jim Roberts, who's also had a very long career at the Foreign Service of the United States in countries like Mexico and Portugal, and both are co-authors of the index. And our third guest is chief economist at Presentación and best-selling author Daniel Lacalle, who's published several books on the topics of economic freedom, including one specifically devoted to economic freedom. And by the way, Daniel is about to launch his new book, Freedom or Equality, which will be broadcast to America. This launch will be broadcast to America thanks to the Heritage Foundation on June 4. More details on that to follow soon on social media and the Heritage Foundation's website. But now let's get to our debate. Ambassador Miller, pleasure to have you. If you could please walk us through the key elements of the Index of Economic Freedom, go to the basics of this project and discuss what are the main findings for 2020.
Thanks a lot. I'm delighted to be here today. It may seem a bit odd to our guests to be gathering to talk about economic freedom. Most of us are locked down in our homes. Many of us are unable to get to our jobs or certainly to perform them in the same way we did in the past. The truth is we have virtually no economic freedom whatsoever at this time. For me, that makes this the ideal time to think about economic freedom, and I think it's imperative to talk about it. If we and our leaders in government don't fight to maximize economic freedom in every decision we make, we're likely to suffer a more severe and more long-lasting recession than would otherwise be necessary. We know from history and the mountains of data we collect for the Index of Economic Freedom that countries that maximize economic freedom also maximize prosperity and the well-being of their citizens. The current debates about reopening our economies are really, in fact, debates about restoring economic freedom. The freedom of individuals to travel, to work, to interact with others, those are the basic requirements of commerce. Well, from a purely economic freedom point of view, we need to reopen our economies now. Ideally, we would open them even more than they were open previously. We would reduce government regulations, we'd reduce taxes, we'd eliminate corruption. But obviously, during a health crisis, that's not the only consideration. We have to fight the virus. We have to ensure that our hospitals and healthcare providers have all the resources they need. But economic deprivation has negative health consequences as well. It's a balancing act. I personally would be inclined to believe that the market system, with its highly dispersed decision-making processes, is more likely to get that balance right than will a centralized government bureaucracy. Of course, that's a judgment call. I want to say just a few words about the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. We've published the index since 1995, and it contains compelling evidence that economic freedom is the key to progress and prosperity. Nations with higher scores on the index are those that best protect and promote individual liberty and the free exchange of goods and services, regulated by markets rather than by the government. The results are outstanding. Per capita incomes are much higher in countries that are more economically free. Economies rated free or mostly free in the 2020 index generate incomes that are more than double the average in other countries. And they're more than 5 times higher than in countries where economic freedom is repressed. Economic freedom is also strongly correlated with overall well-being, including such factors as health, that's pretty important to us right now, education, the environment, innovation, and democratic governance too. There's a strong relationship also between improving economic freedom, not just the level overall, but changes in the level of economic freedom, and achieving higher per capita economic growth. No matter what the existing level of government or of development, countries can get a measurable boost in their economic growth by increasing economic freedom. Well, the 2020 Index of Economic Freedom showed that economic freedom was on the rise in an interconnected and challenging global environment, and it had actually reached the highest point in the 26-year history of the index. That, of course, is all out the window now. We're not remotely in that same circumstance at this point. But what's not out the window is the importance of economic freedom in Spain and around the world. So now I want to get into a little bit greater detail, and I'm going to do that by turning this program over to my colleague, Jim Roberts, and he can report specifically on how Spain did in the Index of Economic Freedom.
There's our top score, which, of course, this data is from July 1st, 2018 to June 30, 2019. So clearly well in advance of the considerable disruption to the global economy that we're experiencing at the moment. And even the 2021 index will not show the full impact of this very big global downturn. But next slide. As Ambassador Miller said, this is very much linked to more prosperity. Higher scores on the index is correlated with higher per capita PIB, GDP. And I'm sorry, and so the next slides, these are the regional averages. And of course, we're in Europe today, and it should be pointed out that Europe as a whole has the most economic freedom in the world, according to our index. I think that's an important thing to remember as people are considering proposals from the left, from the socialists to, reduce economic freedom, reduce the power of markets by more regulation, more control, which unfortunately this pandemic has empowered those in favor of more government, has enabled them perhaps to do. In fact, Dr. Lacalle and I have a paper coming out soon from Heritage that goes into some of these issues in more depth. Next slide, please. So, and also how important it is to have economic freedom, not just for a year, but for 5 years, for 10 years, and the lost opportunities that are permanently lost for countries that don't have economic freedom are permanently behind in terms of growth compared to those that have adopted more economic freedom. Next slide. Again, more evidence that economic freedom is the best way to attack and reduce poverty. Next slide. And by the way, I think all these slides could be made available to anyone who wants to get them. I think
Mr. Roberts, in fact, they will be available as to all our viewers at ieemadrid.es, ieemadrid.es. As well as the index, which I forgot to say, it is available on heritage.org/index.
Yes, You can look at Spain directly there. The poverty intensity also, which of course in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and parts of Asia is very important to note. Next slide is what Ambassador Miller mentioned about the correlations with better health, better environment in terms of clean water, clean streets, and clean air, and education achievement also. Next slide. The also social progress and human development, which are both issues that the proponents of big government always talk about, and they want a bigger role for government, but in fact, economic freedom delivers the most development in these areas. Next slide. Same with social progress. Next slide. That's also with democracy, stability. These are the leaders this year. The 6 countries in the world that were truly free, that had overall scores above 80. Next slide. Regionally, in Europe, Switzerland came out on top. And it's interesting that some of the other countries, we'll get to in a minute, it'll be interesting to examine other countries within the European Union. Next slide. So of the top 10, in Europe, you have Denmark, United Kingdom, Ireland, Switzerland. Those are in the top 10. Next slide, please. Now here we are with our details about Spain. And ironically, Spain had a higher fiscal health score, which now, of course, with the spending, floodgates having been opened all over the world, all countries will likely drop in the years to come on this score. But that's where it is now. It's 66.9. I don't know if we can see the bottom of that slide. Yeah. Well, anyway, on our website at heritage.org/index, you can see a trend line for Spain and all the other countries. All of these indicators, rule of law certainly is strong in Spain, stronger than the global average, but all of the government size indicators are below the global average. And that's something I think Dr. Lacalle will focus in on especially. The next slide looks at open markets. Certainly Spain is well ahead of the world in that. And I should mention that rule of law in Europe in general is the highest in the world, the rule of law indicators. Again, on regulatory matters, Spain in some cases like labor freedom, business freedom are just marginally around the global average. And that's obviously an area for improvement. Next slide. Here is Spain amongst its neighbors in Western Europe and the EU. Spain is above France, just barely, and above Italy, but otherwise lagging behind those other countries that you can see. Next slide, please. So anyone who wants to get more information can go, as Diego said, to our index page at heritage.org/index and look at a lot of information that's available to download. There's an interactive tool to compare countries and regions. And we welcome the interest of our audience today in this subject. We're grateful that there's always been so much interest in Spain about the index. And we're grateful that because of that and the coverage in Espanol, that these good free market messages reverberate throughout Latin America also, which is directly beneficial to the United States. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Dr. Daniel Lacalle for follow-up. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Daniel, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you first and foremost to the Heritage Foundation for this extraordinary work, Ambassador Miller, Dr. Roberts, and Diego for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the findings of this extremely important index. I think that what it shows is some positives and some negatives in the case of Spain. The first thing that is important is that Spain remains at a level that is certainly disappointing for somebody that defends free markets and sees the importance of having an open economy in order to achieve higher levels of welfare. Spain remains on the moderately free level when it should actually be, precisely because it's an open economy that is very open to exports, that consistently attracts investment from abroad. It should be at a higher level. It is good to see that it has improved in particularly in one area, which is fiscal health. And that is a key part, because historically, one of the challenges of the Spanish economy has been to achieve a level of fiscal health, and government proclivity to spend is very, very high. Unfortunately, there are many barriers to improve in the next index, because with the new government in Spain, what we are finding is that the actions and the policies that are being implemented by the government are actually more inclined towards lower economic freedom, higher government spending, higher levels of government control. And also, very worryingly, it is very, very disheartening to see how the COVID-19 crisis is creating almost an excuse for that agenda to be implemented. The positives remain. I think that despite whatever the government is doing, it is important that, as Dr. Roberts was mentioning, we are in the European Union. Europe is fundamentally based on freedom and economic freedom. It is very unlikely that after this crisis, the European Union as we know it, or the Eurozone, will survive unless it promotes the ideas of freedom, open markets, and interconnectivity between nations, and that is, in my opinion, a positive. I think that what is also important to remember is that the gradual improvements that we have seen in economic freedom in Spain are longer lasting. And one of the slides that Dr. Roberts was showing is very important, is that once people understand the benefits for welfare and for social cohesion that economic freedom provides, it is very difficult to bring them back to the old and obsolete ideas of government control. So we have a lot to do. There is a lot of work to do from people like Diego, like myself, and the Heritage Foundation in the next years, in order to remind everyone that the messages of intervention, the messages of magic solutions provided by governments, and the idea that less freedom will provide more prosperity are going to be tried, and we need to fight against them. So it is quite good to know that Spain remains in a moderately free level. It is very important that we, as commentators and people that have a little bit of access to the media, have a constant fight to remind citizens of the benefits of openness, free markets, and economic freedom. And it's also extremely important that the index continues to show especially to people in the left, that the countries that sometimes are sold to us as the model, the Nordic region, the Nordic countries, are actually leaders in economic freedom. And that one of the reasons why they have better welfare and why they could build a certain level of a welfare state was precisely because they put the pillars of private property, of open markets, individual initiative, and freedom as the key pillars of their society. So I would only finish by saying that I think that this index is absolutely critical these days, that we need to do everything that we can in order to promote and dissect the results that come out of analyzing the data and show it to people, proving them that this is the way to prosperity and to higher welfare, not government intervention. Thank you very much.
Terry, Jim, Daniel, what a pleasure to listen to all you three talking about these very important topics. And I just wanted to go back to Ambassador Miller to discuss the current status of economic freedom. I know it's very early to start making assessments, but you will actually very soon start compiling data for next year's index. And we know that many of the pillars of economic freedom have been affected by the pandemic. So what's the key message that you would like to put out now that everything that most governments seem to be thinking on is the type of policy response based on demand, such as increased government spending and so on?
Well, the problem with increased government spending is that that money has to come from somewhere, and governments will either borrow it or they'll raise taxes, but there's not a free lunch, as we say in the US out there. This stuff has to be paid for. And I saw a very troubling report just in the last couple of days that people were projecting a deficit in the Spanish economy of over 10% of gross domestic product, a government deficit. Well, the EU standard is 3% for that. So you're going to just blow right past that. And all the progress you've made over the past decade will be just essentially wiped out. And what you're leaving there then is a big debt that has to be paid for. Either by your children or in the short run by raising taxes, and that's going to depress economic activity as well. So this is true not just in Spain, but it's true in the United States and in governments all over the world. These big government responses of spending rely on a model that projects government demand as being the most simple way, I guess, to get an economy moving again. But that's not what the data in the Index of Economic Freedom tells us. That tells us that if you that it's the demand of individuals and individual firms that are actually producing goods and services in the economy that actually are the foundation for fast economic growth. So I'm really concerned about all this spending that governments are undertaking now. Now, some of it's better than others. If governments do some spending that's truly an investment of one kind or another in better infrastructure or in something else that makes people more productive, then that may have a good payoff in the future. But spending that just moves resources around or borrows from the future to increase people's incomes now is not likely to increase growth. The last thing I would say about this is that spending that keeps people connected to their jobs in some way is extremely important. If you just have an unemployment program that involves the government paying funds directly to individuals, then that can cause people to get separated from their jobs and they no longer have that connection to their former employers. And when we do get back to work, when the economy gets going again, we may still have a terrible unemployment problem at that point. So it's really important in the short run to keep people as connected to their previous jobs as you possibly can.
We have a really, really strange way of dealing with this in Spain, which actually calls for government authorization to proceed with the furloughs that you already have going on in the United States. So the degree of uncertainty there certainly is very high, and the program originally called for all workers to be incorporated immediately as soon as the confinement measures are lifted. Obviously, this is starting to be relaxed, but still a long way to go and too much rigidity in our labor market. Mr. Roberts, what's your take on the economic outlook for the United States? We know that growth had been higher in these past few years. There was talk of a Trump-induced boom thanks to some supply-side economics that were implemented, but obviously the situation right now is going to call for some new ideas. What's your take on the outlook for the next couple of years in the US?
Well, as Ambassador Miller mentioned, there is a real battle going on at the intellectual level and the policy level in this country, and I'm sure in Europe. And really, the answer is letting the market take the lead on getting us back to work. And I think you're seeing that struggle play out now among the 50 states and the governors. And you have, at this point, the goalposts keep getting moved by the public health officials. First, they wanted to flatten the curve to minimize the virus. And now they're basically saying we want to have the virus completely cured before anybody can go back to work. That's sort of like the bottom line message. And that's just not resonating. And the American people are just not accepting that. And on the other hand, you have these big government programs that will rush through Congress. One of them is about paycheck protection, the PPP. That requires that a small business keep everybody on staff and then bring them all back to work so that they don't have to pay that money back. But the reality is that restaurants, when they're able to reopen, are reopening at like 50% capacity. For example, they can't bring back 100% of the workforce. And so therefore, under the rules that were set up, they're going to owe all that money on top of trying to save their businesses. And that's just one example out of many. And of course, small business here in the United States has been the engine of growth. Small startups that turn into Googles and Apples and other huge companies in the high-tech area, plus just the businesses that provide everyday health and benefits to the people. So we're seeing a disruption that could have some good consequences in education and healthcare that may really bear fruit, sort of the silver lining of this epidemic. But we have to be on top of it, as Daniel Lacalle said. We have to be on message. We have to have our voices heard as the debate goes forward on reopening and recovery.
Very interesting point, Jim, because indeed the original idea was to flatten the curve, and then it became a whole different story. And so far, Spain has been in almost total lockdown with one of the most restrictive confinement strategies of the world for over 2 months now. So obviously, big economic cost. Daniel, I wanted to touch upon two topics with you. One, I'm sure you've heard this dichotomy. We need to choose between saving lives and saving the economy. Can we just do both? And two, what countries you think that have done better under these circumstances in trying to protect not just lives, but also the free market economics that have made us not only prosperous, but also healthier?
Yes, thank you. The idea that we have to choose between health or the economy can only be created by a bureaucrat. It makes absolutely no sense. It's not health or the economy, it's health and the economy. The economy is the heart of the social body. You cannot just stop the heart to try to cure something else. You have to keep everything going. And the other day I was speaking with a cousin of mine who's a doctor, and he said to me, look, we doctors, when you come to see me and you have some illness or you don't feel too well, I'm going to tell you what you should do is to not go to work, rest a lot, eat healthily, and sleep a lot. Obviously, you cannot do that with everybody at the same time because you're going to destroy the economy. And this experiment of locking the economy has shown that you cannot just hibernate the economy. The economy starts bleeding because the majority of businesses, as Jim was mentioning, have little more actually than 20 days of cash to survive: restaurants, small shops, etc. And Deutsche Bank was showing that it takes about 20 days to shut down the entire economy, but it takes about 10 times more to reopen it. So the economy is extremely important, and what governments need to do is to provide businesses and citizens with the equipment and with the protocols to address living with the pandemic while we achieve a vaccine or a treatment in order so that the economy suffers the least. Which countries have done the best? Well, the countries actually that are closest to China. If you think about South Korea, it has 259 deaths, and the unemployment level was published yesterday is at 3.8%. The economy is expected to fall 1% in 2020. I'm not saying that you can compare it to everybody, but you can actually say that the countries that have had a much higher level of economic freedom, a much more bottom-up approach to addressing the pandemic, which is to have social distancing enforced from the very beginning, massive tests, and at the same time preserving the business fabric, have been the ones that have done better. Which ones can we, and actually it's very interesting to put together the countries that are at the top of the economic freedom index in 2020 with the ones that have actually done better. Look at the list. If you look at the list of the countries that have actually done better in addressing the pandemic and preserving the business fabric, Singapore, South Korea, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark. You're talking about countries that have one of their key pillars of addressing the global social and local social problems is by improving economic freedom, and that is the way that we should go ahead. If this crisis has taught us anything, is that the mistakes have been caused by central government planning, and we should not give more central government planning power to address the recovery.
Last round of questions. Ambassador Miller, the role of China in this pandemic is coming under a lot of fire, but I'm guessing we could actually expand the conversation a little bit, because China's role at the economic sphere had also been coming under much scrutiny in the past few years. Now, as you know, many media outlets here in Europe have called this a trade war, but there is a lot of points that actually needed to be made in talking about the way in which China is inserting itself into the global trade and economic system for the past several years. Many of it has been legitimate, but there's a lot of shadows at the same time that need to be addressed. What's your take on the future relationship of the Western world with China, not just in economics, but in geopolitical terms?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. Wouldn't it be nice right now if we knew what was actually going on in China connected with this coronavirus? That's where it started. They had a massive problem. They had lots of deaths. And then sometime around 6 weeks ago, the data just stopped. So we have no idea what is happening now in China, how the disease progressed, what measures were taken that were effective, what worked, what didn't work. Those kinds of pieces of information would be incredibly valuable to the United States, to Spain, to countries all over the world right now as we try to decide what the best path forward is. But the Chinese, because they work and operate a system that's completely closed and where the leaders of the country don't really enjoy any kind of popular legitimacy, democratic legitimacy, they try to protect themselves by hiding what's actually going on and preventing their citizens and the rest of us from knowing what's happening. So that's a real problem in a situation like this. Now, you ask a broader question than that. You ask me about the entire economic relationship with China, and that's a relationship that's been broadly beneficial both for Europe and the United States and the people in China as well, as China has integrated into the international economy. But because of the nature of their system, they still don't operate on the up and up, I would say, in the same way that businesses in Europe and the United States do. They don't have the same degree of transparency at all. They operate under stricter government control. Government controls the investment climate completely. There's not any free flow of information. And it's just very hard. That creates a lot of friction when the free market system interacts with that kind of closed system. That doesn't mean we can't trade with the Chinese and benefit from their ability to make goods and services, to provide goods and services for the rest of us. I think we ought to do that. We need to continue to do that. It'll be to our benefit to do that. And I'm not in favor of a trade war per se. I certainly don't approve of the use of tariffs or other kind of protectionist measures to control trade flows. But I think there are some legitimate grievances there with China, particularly because of the controlled nature of their system. And we have to be careful. That increases the risk for our businesses in interacting with the Chinese. We need to do a better job of protecting our intellectual property and making sure that the Chinese live up to any bargains they make. But that doesn't mean cutting off the whole relationship. We've had that situation in the past. I'm just old enough to remember quite well when we had no trade whatsoever with China. And we're much more prosperous as a result of opening up that relationship with the Chinese. So we don't want to go all the way back to where we were 30 or 40 years ago, but it is important that we encourage the Chinese to keep evolving, to keep reforming their economy and their political system as rapidly as possible. And that means we have to stay engaged with them.
Mr. Roberts, I wanted to touch upon one topic that has disappeared all of a sudden out of the media and agenda, but it was a big topic until very recently, which is Brexit. I recall in your last visit to Spain how you did predict that Brexit would be an event that could be handled by all parties and that would not need to bring the type of doomsday that some commentators were discussing at that time. Now, your opinion was, I guess, validated by the fact that over the past few months, the relationship between all sides has remained cooperative and mutually beneficial. So what's your take on that now that it's all happened and I guess you've been proven right?
Well, I'm not going to gloat about it, but I think I think it's an important wake-up call for Brussels to back down from this very kind of undemocratic command and control approach to the economy. Other countries are objecting also. And it doesn't mean, the United Kingdom is not going to move somewhere else on the earth. It's right next door to the continent, and as it's been for thousands of years. And they will figure out a way to get along. There's obviously brinksmanship going on between the Boris Johnson government and Brussels about what form the continued future cooperation will take. And meanwhile, we at the Heritage Foundation are very excited about the potential for a US-UK free trade agreement, which is also moving along sort of in the background for us. I think it's important, and I think we will also have some kind of an agreement with the European Union, the 27, also coming soon. I hope so, because there are some hiccups and some road bumps along the way right now with some of the countries. But I think the approach going forward, at least starting to recover from this, is to focus on our friends. Certainly in the United States, we're very supportive and promote heavily the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the successor to the NAFTA. We think that is the best way for Mexico, which is the poorest of the three, to recover. And also it has critically important intermediate goods that are supplied to U.S. manufacturers, that those factories need to reopen. So I think if we're going to reform the WTO to fence those who would break the rules for their own benefit, I think that's something that we can work on with the UK and the European Union. So I think it's not going to be a catastrophe that the people who were opposed to the Brexit had warned us about. And I think just the track record going just from the time that they left in January is proof of that.
Finally, Daniel, we know your record collection is indeed very large, but that book collection behind you, of course, full of great titles, but I see one specifically that is just out of the oven, Freedom or Equality. Tell us about this new book, because I think it is relevant for the type of conversation that we're having. Indeed, can we have both? Do we need to choose? To what degree economic freedom promotes or hinders equality? Tell us a little bit about this new project of yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, my new book, Freedom or Equality, it talks about all of these topics, actually. And it's interesting that it has coincided with the pandemic, because in the conversation and in the media debates, what we hear all the time are these magic solutions: huge new Green Deals, massive government intervention, Medicare for all, universal basic income, printing money to finance every government spending plan that can be imagined, etc., etc. So what the book tries to do is to give people arguments for that debate, and arguments that show how all of those allegedly simple and magic solutions have very aggressive negative side effects, and most of them actually deliver the opposite of what they promise. So the idea of the book is to give the average reader good arguments for the debate that they're probably living on a daily basis these days. So it coincides tremendously with the message that the Index of Economic Freedom of the Heritage Foundation shows. A lot of the information that we gathered to give arguments to people comes as well from Heritage Foundation papers. And I think it's very important for the average citizen to understand that the way forward can only come from better interaction between nations, from better and more fair trade, as Ambassador Miller was saying, and Jim was also mentioning, and the importance of an open economy, because that's the only way in which we are going to address the social implications of the economic crisis that we have gotten into.
Ambassador, Mr. Roberts, Daniel, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some key ideas, and most of all, thank you all for joining us from your homes in this very special launch of the 2020 Index of Economic Freedom in Spain. Now, as you know, it's been mentioned during the broadcast, if you want to get all the details, just go dive into the data and see how each country is doing, and any indicator that was mentioned here today, just log in now to ieemadrid.es to see the Spanish release, and of course heritage.org/index for the original release in English. Everyone, thank you for joining us, and see you next year, hopefully in a physical event here in Madrid. Take care.
Have a great day. Stay safe.
Muchas gracias.